Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Günter Waibel.
Good afternoon. Whoa, I am loud. Am I better? You guys can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, okay, let's do this. So I am here to tell you about how a 160-year-old museum, the Smithsonian Institution, instead of reaching for the wrinkle cream, reached for a laser scanner in order to move into the future. And just because, you know, this is not a museum conference, I thought I'd say a very few brief words to give you an idea of the scope of the Smithsonian Institution. It's in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. This is an image of the National Mall. What you see along the National Mall, most of those buildings are museums that belong to the Smithsonian. We have 19 museums total, 9 research centers, and we have the National Zoo as well. The collection is ginormous. We have 138 million objects and specimens, and we also have a huge research investment with 500 scientists with boots on the ground in 100 countries. So it's a very, very big, very diverse, and rather decentralized place. And when it comes to access to the collections, if you come visit us, you come to the National Mall, you make the trip, you see less than 1% of the collections on display. That's just simple math and, you know, restrictions of space. In terms of digitization, and here I mean not 3D, I mean just digital photography, we have about 2% of our collection digitized. So clearly, we're facing an enormous challenge here, or I would like to look at it, a tremendous opportunity. And I'm here to talk to you about one aspect of that opportunity, which is 3D digitization of the collections. And the basic idea here really is that we were looking at cutting-edge technology that is becoming accessible to us, like laser scanners, arm laser scanners, medium-range laser scanners, as well as photogrammetry techniques that were used all to great effect in other communities and have revolutionized other communities, such as design or architecture or Hollywood. And we were trying to figure out, well, if we throw the Smithsonian into that mix, what will actually happen here? How does this apply to a museum mission? And I want to start out this talk sort of with some of the stories that came out of our investigation into how 3D and the museum actually mix and come together. So I'm going to talk you through a number of vignettes here of collection objects we 3D digitized and why it was compelling and what came of that project. And we're going to start at the National Museum of American History with a gunboat, the gunboat Philadelphia, which marks the beginning of the American naval fleet. It was used on Lake Champlain to trap the British fleet. Everybody knew that everybody on this gunboat would die because they were merely there to stall the British. And sure enough, this gunboat was sunk. And in the 20s, it was hoisted to the surface of Lake Champlain and came back to life. Because when it sank into waters of such depth that at that depth and that temperature, bacteria that degrade wood can't live. So funnily enough, at the bottom of the lake, the boat was basically perfectly preserved. In the 50s, it was hoisted into the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian as it was being built, and the museum was literally built around that object. And when you see it in the gallery, it's actually quite hemmed in. You can't walk around it all the way, and you can only see it from certain angles. It's a real iconic Smithsonian collection object, but because of the way it is presented, it's actually kind of tucked away, and it's a little bit unknown. So we 3D scanned it, created a whole bunch of data of this rather sizable object. And one of the things that was particularly compelling about this project was that the conservators said they wanted to have data that they could track over time because the object, the wood, is decomposing now in rather interesting ways that we're trying to figure out how to arrest. And in order to arrest it, we need to figure out what's actually happening to begin with. So that's a historical object that we did. Now I want to switch to an art object from the Smithsonian Sackler Gallery, our Asian art gallery. What we have here is a stone sculpture of a called the Cosmic Buddha. It's 1,500 years old, and as you can, I hope, make out, the screen is a little small, it has low relief carving all over its front and back. That carving used to be colored, so it was a bit easier to read, but now it's actually quite hard to read. Even if you stand in front of the sculpture, I think you see that there's this carving, but maybe you just feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that's here and by your inability to properly read it and track it, because it's difficult to make out. Traditionally, an object like that would have been studied and documented using charcoal rubbings, and here's some exemplary rubbings. So that's a contact methodology. You're putting paper on that object and you're rubbing it with charcoal, just like we all did as kids with pennies and paper. So that's now frowned upon. We don't want to do that anymore because it suddenly degrades the object. So we used laser scanners in order to digitize that particular object and get a great deal of data on it. And even before we were really done with the process of post-processing that data, the curator could already, on some preliminary renderings, do some tremendous work in tracking the figures depicted back to Buddhist cosmology, and then ultimately creating a map for the entire sculpture and which segments of the sculptures related to which pieces in Buddhist mythology and in Buddhist scripture. So the curator told us that while this is an iconic Viersackler object that's very well known and very well studied, in the process of doing this work and in the process of using 3D, he discovered things about this object that he had never known. And that was enormously gratifying and meaningful to us. And we'll show you later on in a live demo of 3d.si.edu what that object looks like online and how you can make the low relief carving pop in a way and make it legible in a way that you just can't physically standing in front of the object. And here you see a rendering next to a photograph, and that already gives you a little bit of a sense of that. The next case study I want to talk you through comes from the science realm. This is one that attracted a good bit of attention. One of our scientists, Dr. Nicholas Peinzen, got a phone call from Chile saying, as construction crews were widening the Pan American Highway, they unearthed a cache of fossil whales. Turned out to be over 40 fossil whales, pristine fossil whales, that now needed to be documented and moved with extreme haste because the scientists were literally holding back the bulldozers to do that work. So the 3D team from the Smithsonian, actually, I'll first tell you about how traditionally these kinds of things would be documented. So traditionally, you draw a 1 meter by 1 meter grid, and you draw out how that fossil lays in the ground. And you can already see how the accuracy of that is probably not all that great. So the scientists then talked to Adam Metallo, who you see here, and Vincent Rossi, and brought them down to Chile to document this find using laser scanners. And here's the scientist, Dr. Nicholas Peinzen, who was live blogging about this as the work went on. And ultimately, while the fossils are now jacketed and in the National Museum of Chile, they're not completely inaccessible because it'll take years, if not decades, to prep them and make them accessible to researchers. But we came home with data that very quickly allowed us to output models as well as 3D prints, tell the story of this find, and ultimately now a research paper has been published that Adam and Vince are co-authors on, based on the find and based on the 3D data that helped document it. Another output from the project is the largest museum quality 3D print ever created, at least we think so. We don't know of any larger one, and you see it here mounted on the wall of the National Museum of Natural History. And here you see the team standing in front of it, and I should acknowledge in the middle there is Ping Fu from 3D Systems. She's a senior vice president there, and 3D Systems donated that 3D print to the Smithsonian. And I have a very brief video for you that just showcases how that ginormous 3D print was put together. It was printed in tiles. You saw it here. Please don't turn the audio up. And then it was assembled, put together, and ultimately mounted on the wall. One of the funny stories about this is we wanted to create a 1-to-1 scale print. This whale is 26 feet long, but we couldn't find a wall in the museum that was empty and 26 feet long. So we had to settle for a 20-foot size whale. Slightly bummer, but hey, still enormously cool. And at this point I want to bring up Vincent Rossi, because I can talk about these stories, but he's actually lived most of these, and he's going to talk you through 3 more of these.
Thank you, Günter. So next we're going to talk about the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. Most people don't realize that they run all of NASA's space telescopes. So here's an image of the Chandra X-ray telescope. This is one of the telescopes they run. And they're able to scan a deep space object. So this is 11 billion light years from Earth. So using the X-rays with the telescope, they were able to create a 3D model. They use volumetric processing software, the same software you would use to process MRI data, to create that volumetric model. So this is another example of something we could deliver online that's really compelling. But we can also download this and 3D print it, and what the scientist says, 3D print an example of cosmic death and hold it in your hand, which is pretty cool. So next, we're moving over to the Natural History Museum. So our office is a repatriation office, and what we did was we collaborated with the repatriation office and 3D scanned a killer whale hat. And here we see the scan happening, and we also see the tribal leader, the Tlingit tribal leader, Edwell, on the left side of the screen. So we laser scanned this object, and we created a replica. So whenever you repatriate an object, we're doing important work. We're giving these objects back to their Native American communities, but it does represent a loss to science and a loss to our collection. So we feel like this is a really powerful use case in that we can satisfy the needs of repatriation and satisfy the needs of our scientists. So here we have a replica being CNC machined. So instead of 3D printing, we have an additive process. This is a reductive process where we start with a block of material. In this case, we started with a block of alder wood. So we were, throughout the whole project, working very, very closely with the Tlingit tribe. And we made sure that we had the exact same type of wood that the wood carver would have used to do this machining. And here's the end result. So it was a complete digital workflow creating this model, except for the painting, of course. With the painting, we enlisted the help of an artist at the Smithsonian. And here the object is being presented to Edwell at the Tlingit Clan Conference in 2012 in Sitka, Alaska. And this is a really amazing photograph, because here we see the grandchildren of the original owners of this killer whale hat. And they're wearing the original killer whale hat along with the CNC machined one side by side. So what was surprising is that the Tlingit tribe really embraced this technology, and what was meant to be an object replica project became something more, because we were able to bring this to the clan conference, and it was actually danced with on stage, and we thought that was just incredibly powerful. So they sort of breathed life into this object in a way we didn't expect. Some other hats at the conference. And one thing, we also brought our 3D scanning equipment up to Sitka, Alaska. And we weren't sure whether or not people would be interested in having some of their own objects 3D scanned. Because there's a fire that happened about 10 years ago where a house burned down, and I think maybe 15 or 20 of these hats are gone forever. So to our surprise, a number of clan members came up and volunteered their hats to be 3D scanned. So these are not Smithsonian objects. These are objects that the clan This is a frog hat that we 3D scanned. And another thing our team does is we'll go into the field and we'll 3D scan a site, and we'll show up with Canon 5D Mark II cameras, so we'll do photogrammetry, but we also try and sort of document the entire context of the object. So we're able to capture interviews. So we're not videographers, but that contextual information is really important. So we're 3D scanning the objects, but we're also capturing the stories about these objects as well. So next we're moving over to another on-site project. This is Flores Indonesia, a project for the National Museum of Natural History. And we were tasked with 3D scanning the entire cave. And that's a very, very challenging project due to the complexity, the size, and the remote location. Flores is a small island off of eastern Indonesia, and we had a lot of equipment to haul out there. In this cave, Homo floresiensis was discovered in 2006. And here we see a skull of Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit by the media. So this is a new form of hominid that was discovered, and at its full height was about 3 feet tall. So this is a big discovery, and it shook up the world of paleoanthropology. So our job was to capture that contextual information in 3D. So we 3D scanned the cave, and we also did some capacity building. So whenever we go on an on-site project with photogrammetry, sort of democratizing 3D capture in a pretty big way, what normally would happen is they would dig 10-centimeter increments, right? And they would sort of document with the sketching method that Günter talked about, and they would take a photograph. So we were talking to their team and said, okay, well, if we take 60 photographs in this way and just save that data and hand it off to us, we can generate 3D models. So we did a little bit of capacity building, and each one of these dig layers, they would do a photogrammetry set. So we have this sort of 3D picture in time of this entire dig site. A couple more screenshots of that data. And again, this is the traditional method of documentation. So before we went to Indonesia, this was the level of detail that the researchers had to work with. And using our phase shift laser scanners, we were able to create an incredibly accurate model. And of course, this is just a plan view, a rendering, but we have this in 3 dimensions. So that wraps up our use cases. I'll pass the mic off to Günter.
So I think what you're seeing here is that there are profound implications for museums in all of this work, because we have scientists going out into the field, and rather than coming home with the bones, they come home with the 3D data. We have a curator who says he's seeing things in an object that he's studied for 20 years that he's never seen before. We have conservators who are saying this technique can actually help us perhaps preserve an object that they're currently stunned by. And we've got educators saying this is an amazing tool for us to talk to the public about what these objects mean and connect them to this kind of material, particularly a generation that maybe is harder to reach of younger folks. So we think this could really revolutionize the museum industry, if you will, in the same way that other industries have been revolutionized, and that's what's so tremendously exciting about this to us. So we launched all of this in the context of a total of 20 projects in November of 2013 as Smithsonian X3D. And here I have to pause for a moment and just explain what that means. We picked this name because we felt we wanted to communicate this idea of the Smithsonian intersecting with 3D and the Smithsonian somehow being multiplied by its connection with this technology. At the time, we actually didn't know about your community, and we didn't know that by picking that name, we would ruffle feathers. And we have since had a lot of communications with the Web3D consortium, and while we had to agree to disagree on the name, the really great thing that came out of all of this is that we're talking, and I'm very grateful that I got invited to speak here, to make the connection with all of you, because I think we share a very, very important mission, which is to bring very compelling 3D content to the web. And it would be wonderful if there was something in what we did that we can bring to this community, and it would be wonderful if we can build on the kind of work that you've done. So I'm really looking forward to that, and looking forward to the conversations we're going to have in the course of the conference. So what we launched was a 3D Explorer, an online explorer that Autodesk donated to the Smithsonian, that can showcase these compelling models in a wonderful online environment where people can manipulate them in ways that often to date have only been possible in standalone software. Here you see life masks of Abraham Lincoln, before he was president and shortly before he was assassinated. The other ingredient to the launch that created a lot of attention was that we actually made the full download of the data available to the public. So all of a sudden you had people who could grab these models, they could 3D print or they could manipulate them in any way they wanted to and investigate the data further. And I think that that was something that really captured the people's imagination. You can go 3D print a Smithsonian collection object and hold it in your hands. That is pretty compelling, and the life masks in particular lend themselves to that. The conference itself, we had industry leaders from Autodesk and 3D Systems in communication and in direct dialogue with directors from our museums. Here we have Kirk Johnson, who's the director of the National Museum of Natural History, and Julian Raby, who's the director of the Fear-Sackler Gallery, up on screen. And they were talking to each other about what this technology really means. So there was a real great moment of bringing industry and bringing very senior museum leadership together. And I should just acknowledge the sponsors for the event here. We're eternally grateful to them for having made all of this possible. Because one of the things you need to realize that while we have a tremendous cache of stories to tell, this is all done with an enormously small team. And you're looking at it right there. And I probably don't even count because I'm just the bureaucrat and I, most of the time do the boring stuff. But it's important to note that the Smithsonian is not a government executive agency. We're a trust instrumentality of the United States government, and as such, we're funded to 2/3 out of the federal government and 1/3 of the funds we have to raise ourselves. So whenever we want to do something really cutting edge and that goes beyond what we've done to date, we do rely on donations and we do rely on fundraising. And our donors were the linchpin in making all of this possible. This is another, just for a lark, screenshot from the conference. We had a tech gallery where we had a photogrammetry setup that can do full body 3D imaging, and this is our secretary, Dr. Clough, being imaged on day 1 of the conference. And on day 2, we had a 3D printout of him that he proudly held up. And again, interesting how this resonated with the public. The tweet that I have a screenshot of here was the most retweeted tweet of the Smithsonian at that point in time. It beat out the panda, and believe me, people go crazy about the panda. Panda's a big deal. So I'm going to need audio on this next thing for a video clip. So we sort of felt that we were onto something big, and we felt that we needed to appropriately document it. So one of the things we did was create a whole series of videos that can tell the story of 3D technology in a museum setting. And I want to show you a 90-second clip of one of those videos, because we think, because of the compelling content we have, we can sort of be a bridge to explain to the general public what this technology is, what it means, and how it can be used in ways that just blow people's socks off.
In simplest terms is measurement. Instead of point-to-point measurement like you do with a tape measure or with a pair of calipers, we're taking thousands, millions, or billions of measurements that describe the geometry of an object.
3D technology really affords us the opportunity to see an object from all angles, to tell the entire story of an object, front, back, bottom, top.
You can create still renders from that 3D model. You can create video renders. You can even take the geometry and replicate it in physical form using 3D printing technologies or other rapid manufacturing techniques.
We've scanned things as small as a euglossine bead using micro-CT scanning technology. And we've also scanned entire archaeological sites in Chile, Indonesia.
You can also use X-ray telescopes that can document objects in deep space at an incredibly vast cosmic scale. Of course, most of the Smithsonian collection lies somewhere in between, and that's what we do most of the time. But 3D technology can be defined very broadly, and what you can capture surprises us all the time.
We want to make sure that any technology we bring in is in service of our mission. So what we've done is we've partnered up with our curators, with researchers, with educators, with conservators, and we've put that technology at their service, and we've said, how does this actually further your day-to-day work? And we've created an amazing array of use cases that actually showcase that in all these areas, 3D makes a tremendous impact and can allow people to do more of the things they're already striving to do. So at this point, we're going to be daredevils, and we're going to go online and check out what we actually launched, and we're going to hope that it'll work. And we're going to do this rather briskly because you all have the opportunity to do that as well, just by going to 3d.si.edu. The thing I want to point out is, let me see whether I have an overview page here. So these are all the models that are up. That we really conceived of this as an educational tool. So yes, you can, rotate the models and do all kinds of things with them. But we also wanted to have a way for our curators to tell the stories of these objects. So you can go on a guided tour with the world's foremost expert on the right flyer, and he can hold you by the hand and walk you through all the salient features of that particular object. So we can fly from station to different details of this object, while Peter Jacob is telling you, I'm sorry I can't see this scroll down to the bottom here, but Peter Jacob is telling you about the different features that you're seeing. For example, right here, we're cutting to the wing curvature, and he's explaining in the text and in the images you can't see, unfortunately, because the screen is so small, about how this wing is curved exactly that way because of the aerodynamics involved, and if it weren't curved that way, it just wouldn't fly. And this tour is particularly nice because it showcases a lot of the different features of the Explorer with the kinds of slicing I just showed here. We can split the screens, we can do all sorts of things. I want to just get to the point where we actually look at the insides of the engine and really communicate in a very different way than we can by traditional means about this particular object. I'm going to ask Vince to come up again real quick and give you a little bit of more in-depth tour of some of the features.
Yeah, we're running a little short on time, so I'll keep this brief. So using the cosmic model to demonstrate some of the manual tools we have here. So if I click on the drop-down, you can pull up a number of the power user tools. So I can turn off the texture map, and I can play with different channels of ambient occlusion. So we're increasing and decreasing the, or depending on curvature, we're darkening the light. And we have 3 different channels for ambient occlusion. We're also able to take measurements. And we're allowed to share a model. So we can grab the embed code very easily, embed it, and a unique URL is generated based on all of those modifications I just made for the occlusion channels. So I can send this, this URL to anyone else, and they'll see all of the exact same settings. And we're also able to do other things, like adjust lighting, change the color, clipping plane. But yeah, I suspect we're all, you guys are all power users here, so I encourage you to check out this tool at your leisure.
So after we had launched this, or actually during the 2 days of the conference that were the launch, we got a whole barrage of media inquiries, and the story is the gift that has kept on giving. This has been on live radio, on live TV. We've had news stories all over the world, and it keeps on going. The team gets interviewed almost every week about this, and news stories come out, and this is a particularly nice one that came out earlier this year by Carl Zimmer in Popular Mechanics about that focused to a great degree on the story of the fossil whales. So it really has sparked the public imagination of what can be done, bringing together 3D technology with the kind of objects and scientific missions that the Smithsonian stands for. And it's been tremendously hot on social media as well. This is one of the tweets that we were the most proud of. This is Adam Savage. Some of you may know him from Mythbusters. And he tweeted to his over 1 million followers that the future has arrived because the venerable Smithsonian has started making 3D scans available. And I think that tweet really captures sort of the amazement that, again, this 168-year-old institution would be able to pull something like that off. And this was the biggest social media event for the Smithsonian ever. We had 15 million impressions on Twitter on the first day of the conference, 25 million the next day, and it just keeps on going. People are tweeting about this every day. But the media is sort of, that's nice, and it carries the message, which is great, but ultimately what we're interested in is what are people doing with this stuff, and how is it actually furthering our mission of bringing these stories and this content to an educational setting and reaching people with these stories. And I have a couple of quick vignettes for you here. So this is another model we launched with. This is a woolly mammoth that I assume a kid, just based on the language that's used here, downloaded, and because they were very proficient with 3D tools, they were able to repopulate that model into an Ice Age landscape. And I think that's exactly what we want to see. People taking these things and being creative with them. Here we have a higher education use case. This is a news story out of a community college in Houston, which on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address 3D printed Abraham Lincoln to teach their students the impact that the Civil War had on Abraham Lincoln. If you hold a 3D print of the life mask in your hand, you can run your fingers over the deep furrows on his face, and you can get a very, very tangible experience of what that man went through. And that's exactly what they did. And here's one of the vignettes we're the most proud of. This is a middle school classroom in Philadelphia where Mark Croxford is teaching students these concepts like aerodynamics using the 3D Explorer and using the Write Flyer and bringing these concepts to life to kids who might have otherwise learned those kinds of ideas in a very boring and dry way. And that is really something we want to focus more on going forward, this tremendous educational potential this technology has. And our educators are partnering with us on this. There will soon be a publication on the Lincoln Life Masks that focuses on supporting core curriculum standards, and so it was trying to build a bridge between the models we're making available and giving teachers the tools to then use those and incorporate them into their lesson plans. And I have another video coming up next for which I'll need audio. Thank you so much. And I want to show you a brief video about the Lincoln Life Masks, both because it's an example of the videos we've done about individual objects, but also because what comes out really nicely is this educational angle here.
The 3D process is really interesting. First of all, Lincoln would have loved it. But above all, what the 3D technology does is it allows us to bridge that gap between the present and the past by recreating his face in a way that students and other people, the public, can appreciate.
Having 3D content that's on a familiar topic like Lincoln is helpful for teachers to make that connection between the frontier of digital learning and what they're already teaching in the classroom. And then for students, the entry point is it's high engagement. They're not quite as concerned about Lincoln as they are with what? 3D? This is going to be awesome.
We start with that very simple question, what do you see? And it's from what do you see that we can springboard into a conversation about Lincoln's biography, about the history of the era, about Lincoln's contributions, the ability to, again, be able to hold the mask in your hand, I think only enhances their understanding of Lincoln because it makes it relevant and it makes it accessible.
Most presidents, or if not all of them, are interested in their legacy and how they're perceived in the future. And I think there's no doubt, in the same way that they would use, say, time-based media, computer, and film as a way of crafting and molding their image, that they would use 3D imagery.
When we think of history, we automatically think of biography because it's the people that shaped the world that we live in today.
anything, in my view, that connects us to the past, is to the good. And what this allows is the wide dissemination of the life masks. It takes that imagery and puts it out in the public square so that people, many more people, will be able to see and enjoy it and hopefully learn from it.
So at the time of this interview, David Ward could not have known, and we did not know, that we were actually not all that far away from creating a 3D portrait of a living, sitting U.S. president. And that's exactly what we did earlier this year, the first 3D portrait of a president, President Obama. And I'll talk you briefly through the technologies that were used and how this actually happened. We partnered with the University of Southern California with Paul DeBevic's team. I know Paul is a big name in your community. And he's around here somewhere. And they brought a mobile light stage they had just developed to this task. You see it in a conference room at the Smithsonian, manned by some of the USC staff, and me sitting in it, and Vince making sure I don't fall out of my chair. And this technology allowed us to create sort of a life mask, the data for a life mask. And then we had to complement that technology with, well, let me talk a little bit more about this. So the way this technology creates incredibly high-resolution data is by using an array of digital DSLRs that are mounted in this scaffolding system and then firing them in quick succession under different kinds of lighting conditions that are tightly controlled. And in that way we get tremendous detail on the face. So we had to complement that with additional technology so we could get enough data for a bust, which was our ultimate goal. And here you see another VIP, our Secretary of the Smithsonian, Dr. Clough, being our willing and patient test subject. And again, this allowed us to complement the data of the face with the rest of the data for the bust. And ultimately then these two data sets were combined by Autodesk into a single data set and then 3D printed with the help of 3D systems. And our output was a life mask of President Obama and a bust of the president that was displayed at the first ever White House Maker Faire. And it's not only remarkable that we have these objects now, but that they actually are becoming accessioned in the Smithsonian collection. So both these 3D prints as well as the data itself will be accessioned Smithsonian collection objects. So they will be officially part of the national collection. So from the leader of the free world to the king of the dinosaurs. Another current project we have going on is the scanning of the nation's T-Rex. And this is a tremendously exciting project. The Smithsonian has just received one of the most complete T-Rex, fossilized T-Rex models, and it's not a model. Help me out, Vince. It's a fossil skeleton of a T-Rex. And well, I don't know why I'm stumbling about this. So the nation's children are weeping because the National Museum of Natural History is taking down the dinosaur hall. It'll be closed for the next 5 years because these things need to come down and they'll need to be reinstalled. And at that precise moment, the T-Rex enters and it is coming to the Smithsonian. And it is coming to our rescue because people can now see the live scanning of that T-Rex, and it's come to us in many different bones. It's over 200 bones that are now being scanned in full view of the public. Here you see John Blundell scanning it while people are looking on. And we're creating color data as well as geometry of these bones individually. And for us, the compelling story here is internally to the Smithsonian that this thing will have to be assembled, right? Right now it's in pieces, it's in individual bones, but it'll need to be what the scientists call articulated. It needs to be posed in a compelling way, and then it'll need to go on exhibit. And as you can imagine, some of the bones of a dinosaur are rather heavy. You cannot do this in real life. This isn't something you do with the real bones. So we're going to articulate this dinosaur using the 3D data, and our scientists can try on the different poses, find one that's scientifically accurate as well as compelling in a gallery setting. So that's a great internal use for us of this data. And then the other thing we're tremendously excited about is that we will make this data publicly accessible for download, like all the other data we have up on 3d.si.edu. So again, people can 3D print from this data, they can download it, they can manipulate it in any way they want to, and it is a beautiful thing, and hopefully the kids will stop crying. So here's where I want to shift gears a little bit. I started out by talking to you about the Smithsonian as being this vast place with 138 million collection items. And what we did so far is we've talked you through some very, very specific use cases for 3D technology. But it's very clear that at the pace we're currently going, we are not making significant progress against 138 million items, right? And that's fair, because what we've done to date is just establish that 3D is a compelling way for a museum to move forward on its mission. But ultimately, we want to scale up. We want to move a lot faster than we've been able to so far. And I want to draw a parallel to traditional digitization, which is sort of the other part of my job, of just digitally photographing the Smithsonian collections. And in that realm, in the digital photography, we can move at pretty great speeds at the current moment. We've done a number of prototypes that show that we can capture up to 100,000 items per year by thinking through the workflows and being very disciplined and having dedicated labor available to us just through a single workstation. So those are tremendous numbers that have rarely been reached in a museum, if ever. And we've really thought through how this works. I don't expect you to be able to read the details of this scheme here, but in essence, the idea is there's a workflow that needs to be thought through that has to do with the physical movement of material, of collections objects. And then there's another workflow that has to do with the digital movement of the digital images. And we have systems that back that up, that we keep integrating more tightly, our digital asset management system, the various collections information systems, and we have systems that then push that data out to the public. And by doing this work and more tightly integrating all of these systems, we're now able to do projects where we can take an object from the shelf and then have it presented to the public in less than 24 hours. Actually, for some of our projects, we can do it in less than 3 hours. And that's something that's never been done before, and we're tremendously proud of both the speed, the quality, and sort of the turnaround to the public. But we want to do even more. We want to go even faster, and that's why we're looking at conveyor belt technology, which for flat objects, objects of a certain size, can reach tremendous speeds. And I don't need the audio on this video. So what you see here is a production implementation of this conveyor belt in Europe at Naturalis, the National Museum for Natural History of the Netherlands. And you see the conveyor belt moving every 4 seconds in order to digitize this collection of botany sheets. And with this technology, we can create not 100,000 digital images a year, but 1.8 million. And all of a sudden, we are now at the scale that the Smithsonian needs to work at, because 1.8 million, that is what will allow us to make meaningful progress here. We're going to bring this conveyor belt to the National Mall. We're going to run it on our numismatics collection, which is a tremendously fun collection of historic paper currency proofs with tremendous detail and beautiful vignettes. And we're also going to run it on our botany sheets. We have a massive collection of over 3 million botany sheets that would lend themselves to this approach, and we're tremendously excited about all of that. So the question now I'm begging with all of this talk about traditional digitization is, how can we bring this to the 3D realm? And there's lots of blank spots on that map, I would say. But there's also a lot of great developments that make us very hopeful. So the team recently traveled to watch the Fraunhofer conveyor belt in action in Frankfurt. And I don't need the audio for this video. And you've probably all seen this, you're all aware of this. This is a short video that showcases this conveyor belt. And again, what excites us about this is that according to the information Fraunhofer has provided to us, we could think about creating up to 24,000 3D models a year using this technology. And if you think what we've done to date is, right now we can do dozens to 100 models a year. If you're thinking about the T-Rex, well, with this we can really scale that up. So that is tremendously compelling to us and the direction we want to move in. And we could use this technology on collections such as the one exemplified by this object, which is ritual vessels in our Flores Gallery that have intricate detail all over them and are fun. And as Vince likes to point out, they can be 3D printed as functional objects. So if it's a tea kettle, you could actually then 3D print that in ceramic and use it. And how much fun would that be? We're also working with Professor Ralph Mueller from Virginia Tech, who has created a conceptual prototype for how to CT scan wet collections at tremendous speed using a robotic approach and a staging approach, which would allow somebody to man the station for a couple of hours, prep objects, and then the robot would move these objects to the CT scanner and away from the CT scanner, and create a tremendous output by being able to run the station 24/7. Again, it's just a concept at this point. There's nothing built. There's nothing real about this other than the gripper and the vessel that these objects would go into, so the standardization of moving these objects. But it would let us make tremendous progress against collections such as these, wet collections that are preserved in formaldehyde, that could be fishes or mammals in the Smithsonian collection. And here's an output that Ralph created of bats, which he is particularly interested in because he wants to study the hearing and the inner ear of bats using these kinds of data sets. So that's another tremendously promising development. But again, I think our biggest challenge, and one that Vince will talk about a little bit more in tomorrow's Cultural Heritage Workshop, is how do we get that entire workflow right, particularly the one of moving the digital data? How do we speed up post-processing? How do we speed up getting these models online? And how do we speed up getting them to the public? And what kind of systems do we need to manage all of this data? These are questions that are not answered and for which we're looking for partners and thinking them through. And with that, I will leave you with some more images of depicting the tremendous scale of these collections, their tremendous beauty, and the awesome responsibility we have, I think, of bringing those out of the shadows and out of these 41 storage units, storage facilities that many of these objects are housed in, and letting them have an impact in the world, letting them out and letting people do research, letting them have experiences with them, letting them be used in the classroom. And that's ultimately what the Digitization Program Office at the Smithsonian does and what we're trying to do with 3D. And that is where I thank you for your attention, and I think we have just a little bit of time for questions. Thanks. Any questions?
Looked at what 3D models might be extracted from historical photographs and movies.
So the question is, have we looked at what 3D models could be extracted from historical photographs and from movies? And we haven't done that in a systematic way, but what we have done is, for example, remember when I showed you the Wright Flyer, and at some point we took down the engine of the Wright Flyer and you saw the pistons? That's obviously not laser scanned data. That is data that was created by looking at the drawings that exist of that motor and then recreating that in a CAD program. So we have used some of that technology in order to bring things to life in that way. Yes?
What do you understand about diseases? Well, at the end you'll end up in the book. How automated you want to
I think I'll bring Vince up for this one. Vince, what is that process?
Yeah, that's a good point. Right now, it's a very manual process, and we're looking at ways to automate it. But generally, with laser scanning tools, the raw data is in my cloud. So we mostly use Geomagic, Rapidform, Polyworks for processing. And with photogrammetry, quite often we're just making the leap from photographs to fully textured models. Yeah. And then, of course, then if it's CT scanning, it's totally different volumetric data sets, which sometimes get tessellated. But quite often the volume is where all the data is at. And one other quick thing about the photographs is that we have played around a little bit in the background and taking historic, like stereoscope photos, and then creating really rough 3D models, but nothing ready for prime time. But if you have any ideas, I'd love to chat about them.
Hey, Tom.
This Günter has written, not just impressive, but very inspirational. In our X3D work, we're really aspiring towards archival use, and we're considering how to define those as requirements and what does it mean. So in your experience with other digital media and other communities, do you think it's possible to, through these use cases, through the requirements, to define what it means to be archival, to create digital assets that will still be useful many, many years from now?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? How do we do that? And at the Smithsonian, for our traditional digitization, for the digital photography, we have systems that have a relative level of maturity that allow us to manage that data, that would allow us to take actions on them, like bring files forward from eclipsing file formats to modern file formats, and so on and so forth. And of course, we have all the we have a data center, we have all the prerequisite checking of the files and redundancy and backup and all of that kind of stuff. I think for the 3D data, all of that just doesn't have that level of maturity at this point, and quite frankly, I think this community, you have all done a tremendous amount of work thinking that through, and that's one of the things that we're here to talk to you about and learn from you, what that means to you, and then we can bring that together with what that means to us. There's a tremendous amount of sort of theoretical work that's been done in the library, archive, museum community around that, which is by and large adopted. The conceptual reference model created by the space data community, which is an international ISO standard that underpins the concepts of preservation, how to think about preservation in a context where you really want to go not just 5 years into the future, but hundreds of years into the future. So there's a rich tradition in our community of how to think about these kinds of challenges, but I don't think we have that yet for this specific technical challenge of the 3D data. Sure? Any other questions? Thank you so much. Well, there's one more.
One short question. You have at the very end of the pipeline, the delivery inside the browser, you have a solution from Autodesk, and this is a contribution. Is it someone publicly available, or are they planning to make it a commercial tool, or can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So the question is about the 3D Explorer that we have online that was created by Autodesk based on the requirements that we collaborated on, and how that is available to the public or for others to use. And that's still an outstanding question. So we're talking to Autodesk about that. Right now, it is a gift to the Smithsonian. We are allowed to use that, but that 3D Explorer is not available to anyone else, either as a commercial product or in any other way, shape, or form. I think they're working through the issues on their side, trying to figure out where they want to take it, and we're talking to them about our hopes and dreams, and that still remains to be worked out. I think it's important to remember, though, that this is a beta. We were trying to really establish the use cases here. We were trying to establish that this is an activity that is worth doing. And so I think perfection was not the objective in all of that. And that's why we're very happy with what that 3D Explorer actually allowed us to do. But we're quite aware that if we want to move forward as a community, we have to have a path forward to share that kind of technology, and that's something we're thinking about.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
As a follow-up to that, can you comment? I mean, the 3D printed objects are available as STL and STL formats in various different resolutions. What is the back end like? What are these files stored as, this mesh data? What's it stored as in an archival format? All that kind of, maybe a little bit more technical. Not a lot.
Just a little. I'll bring up Vince for a little technical.
We'll talk about this tomorrow too. But right now, in terms of the archival nature of the 3D data, I mean, quite often it depends on how it's captured. Again, if it's a point cloud, we're archiving the point cloud as a text file, right? And then what you see in terms of what's downloadable, we have more than that. But given the scale of our team, we simply haven't had time to update it because you can see we're working on a number of use cases that consume a lot of our time. So yeah, definitely look for more updates in terms of what's available via download. Right now, you can't download anything in color, and that's something we want to be able to do. So right now, it's the STL files that don't support color. But we'd like to make something more available where it's not just vertex color models, but fully texture mapped models. And in other cases, I think the D is available, and that's probably like a 25 gigabyte volumetric file. So it's not like we're holding back because of size. It's just given the scale of the team, we just haven't gotten to it yet. So stay tuned for that. But in terms of standards, I think that's part of the reason we're here. We're here to learn from this community.
Oh, great! I hope I can answer it.
What do you think? What is the future of these physical connections? With assuming that you are managed to do all these things you now envision creating a 3D copies or whatever these games you reasonable all the time. Do you do this in addition to the physical objects or instead?
Yes. So it's actually a question that comes up quite a bit. So the question is, all right, if we're now able to create this 3D data and create these 3D printouts, what's the status of the objects then? And if I may be very flippant, do we just toss those now? And I think I can fairly firmly state that we are not tossing the objects. I think it's really important to think of these activities as complementary. You can have a tremendous experience with, for example, the Wright Flyer online, and before you come to the museum, you can go through the tour that Peter Jacob is giving you. You can learn a tremendous amount of that. And I think what that does is actually it creates an even bigger hunger for you to see the original. It doesn't sort of satisfy you then to just have seen the 3D model. It actually now has informed you and created a hunger to see the original object, and then you go and you see it, and because you have this knowledge through your interaction with the 3D model, you see this original object in a different light. You look at details that may not have otherwise occurred to you to look at, and you just come to it with a different set of information. And then when you walk away from it and you go home again, then maybe you look at the 3D model again, and again, that looking is then informed by what you've experienced in the gallery. So there's a constant back and forth between those things, between those experiences, and they're reinforcing each other and they're empowering each other. And I think that's what's so wonderful. You can have experiences in the gallery you can't have with the 3D model, and a lot of those are of an emotional nature. And you can have experiences in the 3D Explorer you can't have in the gallery. You just can't get that close. You can't manipulate the physical stone sculpture of the Cosmic Buddha in the same way and really see these carvings as starkly as you can online. So they really go together, and so both have their place and both have their function, and that's, I think, part of what's compelling. Does that answer the question? Thank you. Yep.
So you've talked about the geometry and textures. What about more difficult material properties than just the texture, and also like the fuzzy edges of a book, right? This is something that's really tough. Is that, to what degree is that something that you're looking at or need to look at? Right now the models are somewhat simple, let's say, if you compare it to the real object.
They're still an abstraction in a way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And on some level. On another level, they're tremendously detailed.
Well, it depends a little bit on what kind of object. I mean, if that has a smooth surface, I think that's probably a very good representation. But for some other things, it can be much less than that.
Right. Yeah, and I think we're always trying to figure out how we can actually articulate requirements for this activity. And I'll give you the example from the digital photography realm, where it's a little bit easier for me to talk about it, and maybe Vince, you want to come up and then talk about the 3D if you feel compelled, if you feel moved to speak. So in the digital photography, a lot of times in the past people have said, our standard for digitizing stuff is 600 ppi, and that's what we do, and that's what we do for everything. Well, that's not very meaningful, really. So what we do is we look at the physical object and we analyze it, often under a microscope. For example, for these engravings I've shown you, for these historic paper currency prints, we asked the curator, what is the level of detail you need to be able to see in order for this to be scientifically valuable data to you? And they said, we need to be able to differentiate the finest engravings. All right, so they could have said, we need to be able to see the composition of the fibers in the paper. That would have been a different answer. But they said, we need to differentiate the finest lines of engraving. And so we looked at that, and they were about 20 microns apart. And then we said, okay, we need to find the methods to digitize in a way that can capture 20 microns. And we then translate that into a resolution, and then that's what we capture. I'm not sure that we're quite there yet with 3D to having that kind of process in place, but ultimately, I think that's where we would want to move. So we have an appropriateness of the data we create that is commensurate with the object. Yes?
I've established a method of digitization of the models. I mean, when they come the first time, it's model, then there's a procedure to model them, or you have a priority based on the importance of every item. So you start with the most valuable, or something like that.
So you're asking about how do we prioritize what we digitize? And there's, funnily enough, not a single answer to that question. When it comes to digital photography, our museums prioritize, and they say these are the things that are the most important to us, and that's what we work on that side of the house. For the 3D digitization, what we did was actually ask every one of our museums and scientific research centers to nominate 3 to 4 objects that they felt met a number of criteria, including it has to be iconic, but also it has to lend itself to the process, because not every object is a doable object. And then we picked one of those, and that's what makes up these 20 objects that we've launched. And right now we're working from a list that comes from a book that was recently published by one of our undersecretaries called The History of America in 101 Objects, 101 Smithsonian Objects. And so that gives us sort of a set of iconic objects that we can work from. And how we do that going forward all depends on how fast we can scale up, right? Selection is a very different thing when we're talking about, the 24,000 object that can go through the conveyor belt that Fraunhofer is working on, as opposed to, the dozens of objects we can do with our current means, and we have to think about it very differently. So the approach will mature, hopefully, like everything else. You will give me a signal when we're out of time, right?
Yes.
I'll just keep on blabbing up here, but you need to yank me.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah.
What are you going to do about tracing big objects like planes and tanks or development?
So the question is, what are we going to do about the really big things like our airplanes that are at the Air and Space Museum and in hangars out at the Farhasi Center out by the Dulles Airport? They're obviously a big challenge. I mean, that's a lot of work to do an airplane, a tremendous amount of work, and it's sometimes also technically very challenged because they're reflective surfaces. So we are very cautious in biting that off, because if we bite off an airplane, it means we're not doing anything else for months and months at a time. So again, we're looking to establish scalable models and find technology solutions that are scalable, and hopefully over time we will find better means of doing these very, very large objects, and then our appetite for doing them will significantly increase. Right now, every time I try to get Adam and Vince excited about doing the space shuttle, they're like, no, not excited about that right now.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, of course, with laser scanning, and to your question, there are limitations, right? So line of sight limitations, that's a big problem. There's all kinds of cool stuff inside an airplane you're not going to get if you scan it. So one of the ideas we've been toying around, we haven't brought this up as a use case, but one of the, we have lots of technical drawings of almost all of our airplanes in 2D, they're drafted drawings, right? So those could be scanned, flatbed scanned, and thrown out to the public. So that's a potential crowdsourcing project where that kind of stuff could be brought from like image to flat vector drawings, and someone would create a CAD model based on those 2D drawings, those digitized 2D drawings.
You thought about pulling out the airport bases in one of those planes and disassembling it and doing it right?
That'd be awesome. Yeah, there's an opportunity to do that.
We'll do that next weekend.
Yeah, exactly. And we have there's a place where the planes get restored at the Smithsonian, so that is an opportunity. But really, it's passive.
It sounds like an awesome project. But are you yanking us? You're yanking us. Thank you, guys. Thank you.